Dilemma. I'm Trey Hester, Digital Director for War on the Rocks. In this episode of Horns, Paul Pope, Professor of Practice at the LBJ School at the University of Texas at Austin and Senior Fellow of the Intelligence Studies Project, sits down with Seth Jones, the Harold Brown Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, to discuss his latest book, A Covert Action, Reagan, the CIA, and the Cold War Struggle in Poland. This event was co-sponsored by the Intelligence Studies Project, the Strauss Center, and the Clements Center, and took place at the University of Texas at Austin. Enjoy the show.
Well, hello, I am Paul Pope. I am a professor of practice here at the LBJ School in Austin and a senior fellow of the Intelligence Studies Project. Thanks for joining us on the podcast Horns of a Dilemma. I'm joined today by Dr. Seth Jones. Dr. Jones is the Harold Brown Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he's also the director of the Transnational Threats Project and a senior advisor in CSIS's International Studies, International Security Program. Dr. Jones also teaches at Johns Hopkins and at the Center for Homeland Defense and Security at the Naval Postgraduate School, which is actually one of my alma maters. I think I mentioned to you, Seth. Prior to joining CSIS, Dr. Jones was the Director of International Security and Defense Policy Center at the RAND Corporation, and he also served with the Special Operations Command as a plans officer and an advisor to the Commanding General, U.S. Special Operations Command in Afghanistan, which is where Seth and I first met, actually, in 2009. Dr. Jones specializes in counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, unconventional warfare, and covert action, including a focus on Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and he's the author of a number of books that I have read carefully. And I just want to welcome Seth here to discuss his latest book, A Covert Action, Reagan, the CIA, and the Cold War Struggle in Poland.
It's great to be on. Thanks for having me, Paul.
It's great to have you. And before we get started, I need to give a shout out to the sponsors, Intelligence Studies Project, which brought you here. And the Intelligence Studies Project is supported in turn by the Clements Center for National Security. And ISP, the Intelligence Studies Project, is also sponsored by the Strauss Center for Law and International Security. So international relations, excuse me. So today we're gonna talk about your latest book, which examines a little-known story of CIA operations in Poland, and which produced a landmark victory for democracy throughout the Cold War. It contributed to that. I'm going to let you describe the book a little bit more to us, but it's a fascinating story of a covert action program that was done in a relatively small way, actually remained covert, did not use weaponry, but had kind of an outsized impact. So, welcome to Texas, and I'd love to just ask you first, how did you decide to write a book about this subject, Seth?
Well, I was looking, as any of the books I write, I was looking at a couple of different options. We looked at the counterterrorism arena. The market was pretty saturated. There are a lot of terrorism books. And in looking at other options, I stumbled across a couple of places where in one of Bob Gates's books, in a book by William Dowdy, and then in a few other places, the mention of CIA assistance to solidarity in Poland during the Cold War. But in none of these places had there been any real details of either the program itself or the impact of the program. And it's coming in a time where the recipient of the aid, Solidarity, by the end of the 1980s becomes the government of Poland. So there were a lot of interesting questions that led me to do a little bit of digging on whether there was something that had significance. And I was starting to write this really at the same time where there were early indications of Russian active measures, even before the 2016 election campaign, that they were increasingly involved in these kinds of activities. So it also had some contemporary relevance as well.
You know, I want to get into the kind of the heart of the book and everything, but one of the questions I wanted to ask is sort of a broad question is, had you ever worked with this much declassified material in your research before? Was this kind of I'm interested in the fact that there's whole stories out there yet to be told, and histories that we don't really know about, but they're beginning to come out.
Well, I think there's always a question about how you get information, unclassified information for books. In the last one I'd written on Al-Qaeda, there's a lot of information that I wanted to get, but was unclear how I was going to get it unclassified. And I stumbled upon what was an interesting source, which is when somebody is captured or is being prosecuted as an Al-Qaeda member in U.S. court, that as part of the prosecution campaign by the Department of Justice, that SIGINT intercepts are used, or emails or phone calls are used to prosecute somebody, and that is publicly available. I mean, in some cases, the court have to allow you to get a hold of it. So that's the closest I had come. Is in that case, it was court access to documents that had been declassified for prosecution. In this case, this was archives, particularly the Reagan archives, which was a little bit different. It was actually more difficult in the Reagan archives because most of the information is not available for easy download. You have to go through physical boxes and hundreds, if not thousands of boxes. So the time that it took to start finding some of this information was years more than just weeks or months.
Yeah. Two things in response to that. One is our colleague, the director of the Clements Center, Will Lindboden, is actually doing a book on the Reagan NSC right now, and he's told us the same story. He spent a lot of time in the Reagan Library. But I do think it's important, maybe in this podcast, to mention that, as we're in the shadow of the LBJ Library, that CIA is kind of systematically releasing PDBs, and I think they're a little bit more accommodating in releasing things. The other thing I would just mention to you is that in teaching counterintelligence things here, I often tell my students that if you really want to know the inside of one of these cases, a kind of a secret insight is indictments. So when the Justice Department indicts someone, they release a lot of information about how they built that case and the intel that contributed to it. So going back to the covert action program with Poland, to kind of set the stage for our discussion of that, maybe we could start with what were the Soviets up to, and how did we, the administration of the time, react to that, and how does that affect the story?
Well, I think we've got to place ourselves in the position as Reagan is elected in November of 1980, and then as he's being briefed, along with Bill Casey, who will likely at that point be his CIA director, hadn't been confirmed yet. What the Reagan administration is seeing in its briefings by the current administration, including current CIA director Stansfield Turner, is an aggressive global campaign by the Soviets, particularly the KGB, that was called active measures. And active measures were at their core an effort by the Soviets to conduct influence operations in ways that benefited Moscow and that undermined the legitimacy, the influence of the United States, which was the KGB and the Soviet Union's main enemy. The activities that fell under active measures ranged from some political assassinations to the bread and butter, which were disinformation campaigns, forgeries, the establishment of front groups that pushed out information to the media, organized conferences, covert radio broadcasts in ways that hid the hand of the KGB and were aimed at denigrating the United States. So the Reagan administration came into office recognizing that it was being assaulted globally by an aggressive KGB active measures campaign that was really winning in many ways.
Yes, on that last point, you say they were really winning. I was going to ask that question. So it's not just that they're busy. The assessment of the administration is that it's effective, that the Russian campaigns are actually having an impact, and that we're sort of losing. Is that what you're saying?
I think it's pretty clear, too, as you see the debates leading up to the election of Reagan. I think the American public recognized this as well, which is why Reagan gets elected as the U.S. president on a platform where one of the principal foreign policy promises of the administration is to take a much tougher line globally to the Soviet Union than Carter had done. So it's not something that was just recognized globally, but also by the American population. I think directly contributed to Reagan's election.
Yeah, before we go too much deeper into the campaign itself, I actually think it might be a good time to actually ask you a question about President Reagan himself and his view not only of this particular issue of Russian or Soviet active measures, but also his kind of approach to presidential leadership and his vision. I mean, it seems to me that he had he's not. Let me back up and say that he's not always perceived as the most hands-on president. He's not always, sometimes even criticized for not being the smartest president. But he had this very clear vision with regard to the Soviet Union, and he communicated that vision very effectively. I mean, do you think that was an important part of the context for where this program nestles?
Yeah, I think in looking at Reagan pretty carefully over his time as president, and even before that, as a student he was okay, C's, a few D's, B's. It was a mediocre student at best. But I think as he evolves as an individual, governor of the state of California, and then as president, he's decisive on major issues. And he does actually read quite a bit. He's got a photographic memory, so he remembers facts pretty well. And on this case with the Soviets, it's pretty black or white for President Reagan. He believes that how the United States was formed and its core principles, free economic system, democratic political system, that these are values that are important, and that what the Soviet Union stood for was a closed economic system. It supported atheism, and where its government was not elected, it was an authoritarian regime. That was inextricably evil in that sense. So this was a black or white issue. So as Reagan comes into office, he sees this as a struggle between good and evil, that he's able to look at a program like Poland and an opposition movement like Solidarity that is begging for outside assistance and needs support and is at its core a democratic movement. And he makes a pretty calculated decision that while previous presidents before Reagan had been really cautious about providing assistance to groups operating in Eastern Europe. At the Yalta Conference back in 1945, FDR had essentially ceded Eastern Europe to the Soviet sphere of influence. And for Reagan, in this global struggle, he was not going to cede a single inch of territory to the Soviet Union. I think that made him willing to take a risk that most presidents before him were not willing to take.
So with that strategic background and policy approach and kind of predilections of President Reagan, what actually happened with regard to this program as he turns to you mentioned Bill Casey, who does become the director of CIA. What do they ask him to do, and how is all that carried out?
So real briefly, in August of 1980, the budding trade union Solidarity reaches an agreement with the government of Poland that allows the establishment of self-governing independent trade unions to start existing outside of the Communist Party in Poland. And it's a notable break in Eastern Europe because I think as the Soviets recognize from Moscow, it looks a lot like the early stages of a democratic political movement. It's organized, it's in key locations like mines and in shipyards. And so over the course of late 1980 and into 1981, Solidarity starts to gain strength, traction, and up to 10 million members of an increasingly democratic movement, and then starts to encourage, by late 1981, other movements in Eastern Europe to follow suit. The Soviets recognize rightly that this is a major threat to the entire Warsaw Pact and to communism. So the debate now in the Soviet Union is, do they send in Red Army forces like they'd done in Hungary or Czechoslovakia, or do they basically tell the Poles to do it? And the cost-benefit calculations, and I think that Moscow was right along these lines, is it would have been very destabilizing to send in Soviet Red Army forces into Poland. They would have met massive resistance. Instead, they get the Polish leader Jaruzelski to send in tanks into the street and to start arresting members of Solidarity. So over the course of 1982, the U.S. government has a major debate about what to do in Poland. The budding democratic opposition movement is on its potential last legs. It's being crushed. What should the administration do? Should it do something overtly or should it do something covertly? And what the administration decides is to support a covert action finding to aid Solidarity. It's minimal in its objectives. So it's not looking to overthrow the Polish regime. It's simply looking to provide some assistance so that Solidarity can survive the onslaught it's getting from the regime. And it's done it in the choice is a covert action so that it hides the hand of the government, the U.S. government, because this is and should be about Solidarity. It's getting some assistance from abroad, but I think there were concerns, and rightly so, that you tie the U.S. government hand to Solidarity at this point, it would have just made the situation notably worse. So by 1982 and into 1983, you had the beginning of U.S. assistance through CIA to Solidarity, entirely nonviolent means.
Yeah, that was. I was going to ask the question actually, whether violent means were considered at all.
Yes, several people that I spoke to, including that served on the National Security Council staff at the time, looked at the wisdom of lethal assistance to Solidarity weapons, and they were generally dismissed pretty quickly for two reasons. One is that Solidarity at its core was a political organization. This was very different from Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan that were involved in a war against the Soviet-backed regime in Kabul. So as a political movement, they didn't have weapons. They weren't pushing for weapons. They weren't asking for weapons. The other issue was, I think, sending weapons into Eastern Europe at this point would have been very destabilizing, would have been viewed with extraordinary alarm in Moscow, and it would have led to really a destruction of Solidarity. So for those two major reasons, this turned out to be a political operation, not a paramilitary one.
So we didn't do what the kinetic or lethal, as you said, operations or programs that we had in other parts of the world at that time, like Afghanistan, for example. So what characterized what we did do here? How do we help Solidarity and how did that all work?
Well, I think it's important to understand what Solidarity, in a sense, was. I mean, it was a labor union. It was more of a political movement, but how it got information to the Polish population was through the main sources of mediums at that point, and they were print media. They were newspapers, pamphlets, magazines that were distributed through an underground system to a pretty large volume of Poles throughout the country. There was an initial radio station. It needed some technical assistance, which the CIA gave. And there was also general, over time, technical assistance for television to break into broadcasts. So this was about information. And so if you're Solidarity and you're trying to run an information campaign and most of your information is print media, that means what you need is the material that you use to print newspapers, poster boards, magazines, duplicator machines, paper, ink. Those are the kinds of things you need. And that's what the CIA assistance, the money was used to pay for. It was used to get those materials in locations like Western Europe, either by land to Poland or by sea, shipping through Norway or Sweden or other countries that were near the Baltic coast of Poland, and to get it into the hands of Solidarity members in Poland. And that is really at the core of U.S. assistance. It's the materials to run an underground media campaign.
So when they were getting that material into Poland, did CIA make direct contact with Solidarity? Was Solidarity aware that they were working with us, or was it indirect?
the way that this worked was, I think, really it's a brilliant campaign of how to run an operation through surrogates. In fact, what the U.S. recognized was that a direct connection, whether it was meetings or handoffs between a CIA case officer and a member of Solidarity, whether it was in Poland or Belgium or somewhere else, would have almost certainly undermined the legitimacy of Solidarity, particularly if they'd been identified, certainly captured. And then second, it would have created a big counterintelligence vulnerability for Solidarity because the Solidarity actually was pretty heavily penetrated by Polish security agencies and by the KGB. So the way to do this was there was already a black market network of individuals that had spent several years getting material, this kind of material, to help the underground from France and Sweden and Norway and Italy. What they didn't have was money, and what they didn't often have was also the material that Solidarity needed. So what CIA did is work with those smugglers that were already getting the information and the material that Solidarity needed and recruiting them. And so if you think for a moment of money being handed over to someone in Paris that took the money, purchased the duplicator machines that were loaded onto trucks in France, maybe unloaded in West Germany, reloaded to East Germany. By the time it actually got into an underground shop in Poland, it may have changed hands 6 or 7 or 8 times. So there was no one on the Solidarity end that would have known with any level of fidelity where it was coming from, who gave it, who initially gave it, where the funding mechanism. I mean, they certainly guessed, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly, but never any direct connection. So this was never a case where the CIA worked directly with Solidarity. Solidarity simply benefited from a surrogate program.
I'll just make a comment that as a former operations officer and someone involved in covert action a number of times, I remember an old covert operator guy saying to me one time that you never want to have to bake the whole cake. And so we chose Solidarity, which already existed, to support. And what you're saying is we then chose smugglers that already existed and didn't have to create all of this, which made it possible maybe to keep it covert. It's amazing that this stayed covert and still hasn't been completely acknowledged. But I wanted to turn to a character, actually 2 other characters in your book that are very important. One of them is the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Bill Casey, a very interesting guy. But in the context of my question, also a very devout and deeply believing Catholic. And I also, then the Pope in the Catholic Church was very interested. The Pope happened to be Polish at that time. And so the connections between what the Catholic Church was doing and what the U.S. government was doing through a CIA finding and covert action program, and then sort of the Casey interest in that aspect of the program, I think those are important aspects of the case. Was there a direct alliance between the two? How did that work?
So in a range of the literature that came out just after the end of the Cold War, there are a number of books on the Catholic Church and Pope John Paul II, which created what I'll call a myth of a holy alliance between the CIA and the Catholic Church, which, among other things, cooperated directly to provide assistance to Solidarity. So as I looked at this pretty closely, the story partially fell apart. And the reality looks to me like the following, and that what the evidence suggests, and that is that there were a number of administration officials that did have a relationship with senior Catholic Church officials. One of them was Bill Casey. Another was Reagan, who, while Reagan was not Catholic, although his father was, did develop a connection with Pope John Paul II. They were nearly assassinated around the same time, so also had come through some pretty difficult situations, really together. And they developed a bond. There were other members of the Reagan administration that were Catholic that developed a close relationship with the church. And where the church was helpful with Poland is both the U.S. and the church were on the same side. Both supported solidarity, and not just supported them ideologically, and supported what solidarity meant to Poland and what freedom and democracy might mean to Poland, but also supported assistance to solidarity. Catholic priests in churches across Poland provided locations for meetings between Solidarity members. In some cases, they helped distribute material to members of Solidarity, ink cartridges. So they were working in many ways towards the same objectives. But I think what's important to understand is the CIA program that I looked at was a CIA program. When it came to its design, its finding, case officers involved, it was not a program that included the Catholic Church, for the most part, in its operations. So there was certainly a range of discussions about Poland with senior administration officials and the church, but the program itself and the way it was executed was done as a U.S. program. Now, there were other agencies, including the British, that were aware. MI6 was aware of what the U.S. was doing. There were a few occasions where, as part of the moving of money or material into Poland, Catholic priests were used. This appeared to be a tiny amount of money, for example, used by priests. Priests, it turns out, were generally not checked at the border. So if they were carrying cash with them for whatever purposes, they were not checked. So there were priests that were used to bring in material as part of the CIA program, but the vast majority of the supplies would have come by truck or boat or other ways. So there's a little truth to the myth about a holy alliance, but I think the reality is it was a lot more of a strategic cooperation than there was operational and tactical working together.
I don't know if this would be an accurate way to say it or one accurate way to say it, but it almost sounds like what you're saying is that in the realm of foreign affairs and diplomacy, we found ourselves pretty much on the same side as the Catholic Church, and we're cooperating. But when you get into the programmatics of this program, there was no direct collaboration, which is an important question that is out there. And many times I find that the only thing somebody knows about a question they're asking about intelligence is the conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
And they don't actually know any of the other part of it. I think inevitably I have to ask a question about how we measure success and whether or not our program, the CIA's program, had an impact, and if it did, what do you think it was?
I think it's a very difficult question to answer with any sense of fidelity for a few reasons. One is there was other assistance, especially by the mid to late 80s, that was getting to solidarity, including some pretty big U.S. programs like the National Endowment for Democracy. There were also trade unions in Europe, Western Europe, from Italy and France, that were providing assistance to solidarity, especially by the mid-1980s. The AFL-CIO in the U.S., even in the early 80s, provided some assistance. And then as we get to the late 1980s, there's a lot of other stuff that's going on. Gorbachev institutes glasnost and perestroika, so he's opening up the political and economic systems in Eastern Europe and allowing them to be open up, which allows eventually for even the possibility of democratic elections in countries like Poland. So all of those things, I think, have to be acknowledged in any program like this. So as I look at this, there are a couple of things that I would say suggest what the CIA did actually had a notable influence in at least helping solidarity survive. One is my pretty exhaustive look at funding sources into solidarity indicates that in the early stages of the campaign, so 1983, 84, 85, just after martial law, CIA is by far the largest provider of assistance from outside to solidarity. And this is a period where the solidarity is under incredible duress from the government. Its members are being arrested. There are efforts to destroy the financial network of solidarity. So I think this assistance looks like it certainly helps Solidarity survive. The other issue that strongly indicates that CIA assistance was having an impact is the Polish security services and the KGB start in 1983 to 1984, start making a major effort to identify these sources of assistance to Solidarity coming from overseas. They are very concerned that it is allowing not only Solidarity to survive, but to reach its supporters through newspapers and magazines in ways that are undermining the support to the Polish regime and undermining support to communism. So the fact that the KGB and the Polish regime take what the CIA has done so seriously and are so concerned, we know that from declassified documents, indicates to me that it was likely having an impact. I think it was, if it was not having an impact, you never would have seen the KGB respond the way it did.
Yeah, I think the fact that there was undeniably problems in Poland was sort of giving light to the whole myth of the East European embrace of Marxist-Leninism and that kind of thing. It's very difficult to measure how much that matters writ large. There's one other fact or event that was going on or situation that had occurred at that time that I think might be relevant here, and that is we have a saying at CIA that good FI makes good CA, good foreign intelligence makes for a good covert action program. So we also had one of our more noteworthy intelligence sources inside Poland at that time, a military officer named Kuklinski. Did those two things affect one another? The fact that we had this intel from inside the regime at the same time that we were doing this covert action program?
Well, what's interesting is Kuklinski is a source and is providing information on what is going on inside Poland, particularly the Polish military, up through the end of 1981. Martial law happens in December of 1981. And so what Kuklinski is able to do is to provide pretty good information on how the Polish regime is thinking about cracking down on Solidarity. Once we get close to martial law in mid-December of 1981, it's actually just before that, there are increasing indications among Polish security services that Kuklinski is maybe providing information to the U.S. government through CIA. And so there is he, among several others, it's a very small circle, are interviewed as potential being the source for classified information leaving Polish planning circles about martial law and getting out. And at that point, then CIA helps him get out of Poland and resettles in the United States. But the CIA program actually does not occur for another year. So he's already back in the U.S. And so actually where Kuklinski ends up being helpful is giving the U.S. government, including the CIA, a better appreciation as the program starts, as he's back in Washington. I'm not sure he was ever even read into the program, but at least his insights were used to better direct the program. He's eventually outed by the Poles and used as for disinformation purposes as part of the program. But I think where his benefit is he's feeding information that helps those that are planning the program and executing the program better execute and plan it.
Yeah, I asked my question from the perspective of his effect on Solidarity, and actually what Solidarity was doing, causing what he was reporting on basically was prospects for a imposition of martial law. And that's what actually caused him to be evacuated, right? Was the suspicion that he was the one giving that up. So
exactly.
It's an interesting connectivity between those two things. One thing you didn't do in the book, you did try to evaluate the effectiveness of the program. But what you didn't have sort of a chapter that said, although I think it's woven throughout the book, is, okay, and these are the lessons about covert action that you can learn from this case. And when I read that, I have to tell you that I thought, well, that's a Rand guy. He's not gonna write lessons from a single case. He's, methodologically won't do that. But I mean, I think there were, the things we teach in covert action programs, Steve Slick and I teach, And I wanted to kind of just bounce off some principles and get your reaction to them. So one is that a good covert action program is nestled into a broader set of foreign policy goals, that it is consistent with, not something in lieu of a policy. And when I look at the Reagan administration, NSD 32, which had to do with, their approach to the Soviet Union, and NSD 54, which had to do with Eastern Europe, it seems like there was really alignment between this very small tactical program and their big goals. Is that an accurate reading on my part?
Yeah, I think it is. One of the things that some of the Reagan national security decision directives do is they elevate the importance of information campaigns. So in this case, a covert action program that is largely a political one becomes an important instrument of U.S. policy embedded in other, that can coordinate with other instruments of power. So the U.S. may be deploying theater nuclear forces to balance the potential for Soviet conventional or nuclear operations in Europe. At the same time, it's running these programs to weaken Moscow's grip on Eastern Europe and to support democratic movements. So I think what you've got to do is take a step back and recognize that this particular covert action program is nested in a much broader strategy and series of policies that the Reagan administration had, where it was conducting conventional activities and conventional planning, nuclear planning, diplomatic activity, development actions, and this was obviously intelligence. So it was nested in a much broader strategy and approach.
So another principle of covert action that at least I believe in, and I think others do too, is that you have a much greater chance of success if you're supporting existing groups that are dedicated to a particular cause, and you're only providing assistance to something that's already there. I was sort of alluding to that when I was talking about don't try to bake the whole cake. And I mean, it seems like in this case, we picked a group that was really incredibly dedicated, and the society was supportive. How important do you think that was in the way it went?
I think it was critical. I think, and I note near the end of the book, I don't have a chapter that highlights lessons from this case on covert action, but some of these issues are embedded in those final chapters, and one of them is this particular issue. I find it difficult to believe that without already having an existing legitimate movement that had been built from the ground up by Poles, for Poles, that was pushing for more independence, that was pushing for more democracy, that was organized, and that had reached up to 10 million individuals in mines and in shipyards and in other blue collar locations. You can't. It would have been difficult to create something like this in Poland. The reality is that the administration had to make a decision on whether or not to work with an already existing, already legitimate organization that already had an underground press that was already reaching out to Poles and already had a lot of sympathy and support. What it didn't have was resources. And that meant survival if it could get those. So I think the fact that you had a covert action program that never created something from scratch that worked with, and it wasn't just solidarity, but I think the fact that it leveraged already existing smuggling routes and didn't invent those either meant that it was just leveraging what already existed and wasn't inventing anything. And I think that in the end, it made it A, legitimate, but B, it meant that the bulk of the work was done and should have been done by solidarity members and the smuggling groups. And this comes to the impact that whatever the impact of the CIA was, and I think it was quite helpful and it was definitely beneficial, at the end of the day, it was still solidarity that had organized itself from the beginning, that bled its way through martial law, and that voted, and its people voted for Lech Wałęsa in 1990 to become the leader of Poland. So the Poles were the ones that built it, executed, and the Poles were the ones that won in the end. None of that was created.
I think that's very insightful, and I can't help not to get us off topic, but I can't help but think about even a comparison, not of all covert action programs, but just the covert action programs of that era. we had the Poles, which was the situation you described. We're supporting something very much exists. We have in Afghanistan a similar situation. It's kinetic. It's not similar in every way, but it's similar in the sense that they were fighting with or without us with 1903 infields. And then you have Central America, where I think we were straining to kind of create something that didn't exist, and that didn't go nearly as well, and also wasn't supported by our own Congress as well. And then the final kind of principle I wanted to mention, I think is important here, is that we didn't seem to let our frustrations or our successes or anything kind of knock us off our fairly limited goals. And we didn't overreach. We didn't have mission creep here. It seemed like a very disciplined program.
I mean, I thought one of the interesting things is the debates leading up to the finding in 1982 were really pretty minimal in the objectives. And again, the objectives were not to overthrow the Jaruzelski regime. They were simply to help, at their core, Solidarity and other opposition groups survive, and to see if they could at least open up Polish society to start planting seeds for democracy at some point down the road. And what ends up happening, of course, over the 1980s is that with changes in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe, is the covert action program ends up contributing to a much bigger end result. And that is the entire slate of communist regimes in Eastern Europe collapse. The Soviet Union collapses. And in Poland, the very group that had been supported by Solidarity wins the election and becomes the government. But yet, when you go back and look at the initial debates, that was never the objective. And I think as people recognized at that point, they would have to get lucky. And they would have to be helped by factors well outside of their control if they were to get any end result like that. And I think if you probably ran this experiment 50 times in 1981 and 1982 during the negotiations, you might get lucky once or twice with that end result. Because, again, you were relying on factors well outside of U.S. government control. But in this particular case, not only did it help Solidarity survive, U.S. assistance helped Solidarity, but the end result was well beyond the vision, the objectives of anyone that was involved in the program from the beginning.
Yeah, my view of this period in that particular program is it's probably wrong to call any one of these things decisive or the decisive campaign, but there were a number of very successful things that contributed, and it's impossible to disaggregate the various cause and effects there. I wanted to, I was going to say this with some sarcasm, but I'm afraid some of our listeners might not pick up on it. But and the sarcastic comment would be, but that's just history. It doesn't really relate to today, does it? I mean, it seems like there's echoes of this going on all around us right now. To me, I see a very aggressive Russia. And I think the place they're most aggressive is in the information space. So, I mean, do you see it that way? And what can we learn from this experience that might be relevant to what's going on today?
Well, as I look around the globe, the U.S. national security strategy and the national defense strategy have shifted the U.S. focus from counterterrorism to state-based competitors. And the two big ones that the U.S. has identified our competitors are the Chinese and the Russians. And if we take the Russians, for example, there's evidence over the last couple of years of aggressive, offensive Russian activity. It's not just election-related issue. It's involved in information campaigns to encourage disagreements, polarization on issues from the Me Too movement to Black Lives Matter to gun control, you name it. They have been fomenting or trying to foment through Facebook posts and advertisements, Twitter, a whole range of social media outlets. They've been trying to undermine the support of the U.S. globally. What this reminds me actually of is the Reagan administration comes into power, the way it assesses global Soviet active measures and the playbook from disinformation campaigns, even to political assassinations, what we've seen in the UK in the last couple of years, It is a very similar playbook that the Russians have adopted today, dealing with their main enemy, who remains the United States. What's obviously changed, the ideology is a little different. Marxism, Leninism has gone to the ash bin of history. The types of forums that you might use no longer end up being just print media, but have also added the social media dimension and the internet. But I think what strikes me is it took a number of years during the Cold War for the U.S. to recognize that an important instrument of American power is the information arena. And we went through several administrations where the primary focus was conventional military or diplomacy. And I think it took an administration like Reagan to elevate an offensive information campaign that recognized that these kinds of state competitors, they're authoritarian, they try to control information going to their populations, and that they are extremely vulnerable to an offensive campaign that tries to open them up, that highlights corruption that's gone on within their governments or human rights violation and abuses by their governments elsewhere. And I think that's one lesson that I would take now, is how in this kind of competitive environment against countries like China and Russia, that the U.S. can't be just defensive in protecting its cyber networks. It needs to be offensive, but in ways that are tied directly to who the U.S. is as a democratic country, and encouraging this information to get out, including to local populations in countries that are trying to keep information flows from their populations.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And you and I were discussing last night. I told you about a couple of Russian campaigns that have been run in Texas. One which almost had sort of Texas secessionists shooting at Islamic Houstonians, and another one that it's ironic in the state that had the movie American Sniper and Last Survivor are both about Texans. And when their home organization, U.S. Special Operations Command, wanted to do an exercise here, the Russians labeled it as an invasion by President Obama, and it succeeded in many ways. So, I think this is quite relevant. In my own view, I wasn't allowed as an intel guy to be policy prescriptive, but I think we're sort of on our back heel, we're on our heels here. And it's not about hating the Russian people or revenge. It's about getting our message out there to people and not allowing us to be taken advantage of. Well, I would encourage everyone to read this book. I will certainly be assigning it. A number of my students have already read it. There are many, many reasons, by the way, beyond just covert action. I find the younger generation really needs a better grounding in the Cold War. It's hard to kind of relate to what it was like when I was their age. And so I thought your book really brought that home as well. So I want to congratulate you on a great book and thank you for coming to the University of Texas at Austin.
It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Please do not forget to check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org.